Welcome back, everyone, to SureCloud's podcast, and I'm joined today by a couple of guests. So my name is Nick Hayes. I have been a guest on a previous episode. I'm now hosting today, so I'm sat at the other side of the desk asking the questions. And I have two guests with us. So Chad Brustin from Clyde, and we have James Pierce, who is also from SureCloud. So I'm just going to hand over to Chad in the first instance. So Chad, would you be able to give a brief introduction to yourself, what brings you here today, how you got into security in the first place, ultimately, and then we'll hand over to James and he can give us an introduction to himself as well.
Yeah. So Chad Brustin, I work at Clyde Technologies. We're a startup out of New York City that essentially allows companies to offer warranties for their products. So we have the technology stack that helps with the underwriting and gives the customer a seamless way to add a warranty to the product that they buy, which means that there's a lot of things to secure. Started in cybersecurity probably 6 years ago, came in from the operations side. I was an application manager, and the security director at my former company approached me and asked me to help with some evidence gathering for something called a SOC 2, which I had no idea what that was. And essentially, because I had the understanding of the operations and the processes, and that had the documentation ready to go, he thought that I would be a great person to bring over to cybersecurity, and I could be trained to do a lot of the red teaming, the threat hunting, the blue teaming, the defense in depth, things like that. So he took me under his wing and brought me over to the security team, and here I am. I haven't. It's been the best move, and it's been really nice to bring a lot of the learnings that from my last company, which started out as a 40-person startup, went through 3 phases of venture capital, and ended up, and when I left them after 10 years, 11 years, a 2,500 person company in the utility space. So bringing all of those lessons to bear at Clyde Technologies, and excited to be building a program over the past year.
Excellent. Well, welcome to this podcast, and we'll get a little bit into more of your kind of current day to day, and what Clyde do and what their product is in due course. But James, would you be able to give us a very similar background, hopefully? So an introduction to yourself, what brings you here today, and your journey into security to this point, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you, Nick. So James Pierce, newly of SureCloud. I've been with SureCloud now about 6 months. Prior to that, I was at PwC for a couple of years, and I suppose I really cut my teeth in consulting an NCC group for about 7 years. Like Chad, I was handed a standard in 2008-9, PCI DSS to 1.2, and my boss said, "Look, nobody can understand this. Can you have a go?" And probably not the best place to start PCI, but that was the start of my, I suppose, cybersecurity, information security career from there, and then into 27001 and other governance, risk and compliance projects. And now I find myself, I'm leading business development at SureCloud. So a bit of a mixed bag, a strange non-linear approach, I think, my career.
Indeed. And obviously, if you are starting with PCI, the only way is up, I think.
I think it is. I do have a strange love-hate relationship with PCI now. It is highly frustrating, but I love the complexity of it. And I just like the approach it can take. But,
So it's necessary as well, for sure.
Everyone has to handle credit cards at some point in their career.
Yeah, for sure.
I think what's interesting is now it's so much easier to de-scope with the technology stacks and apps and platforms that are available, whereas go back to when I started, it was everything was hand cranked and crafted and awkward, expensive, slow. So things have got a lot easier, but I think equally cyber in general has got more complex. So it's sort of an interesting balance to strike there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, welcome, James. I'm no doubt we'll see you on future episodes as well. So, guys, just quickly, if you wouldn't mind, give us a bird's eye view of what you're currently focusing on. So, Chad, in your role right now, what's the current focus? What's the things that are driving you in this moment?
What keeps me up at night? I think the for us, it's the strategy for how to go global. Where do you start? How do you manage all the different data requirements to go into the EU, to go into Canada? How do you think about data privacy, data architecture, coupling and uncoupling your tech stack so that you're able to segment your data so that US data stays in the US, Canadian data stays in Canada if that's a requirement, which is not clear in PIPEDA, which is a Canadian Privacy Act, and then GDPR. Obviously, we have to have data in the EU on an EU server. So all of those things, thinking about not only from a security standpoint, where is the data, but where are the backups? How do I manage DSARs, data subject access requests? Here in Los Angeles, I'm lucky enough to have very good familiarity with CCPA, which is the California Privacy Act, and then which is now CCPR, which is the new law that we just passed. So a lot of it is kind of good prep for going into the EU. But at the end of the day, we have to keep our data safe, and we have to give our merchants that good feeling, and we have to show them evidence. It's not just my word; it's third party's word. I have to show them the evidence that we've done all of the things to comply with our SOC 2, as well as make sure that we are securely handling data and answering the 100 questionnaires that we get as third party for the third party risk program. Work with our compliance team and make sure that they understand how our business works, and then show them a network diagram and walk them through from end to end the data flows, and what data are we storing, where are we storing it. Those two questions, which kind of are simple at first glance, but where is your PII and where is your PCI? And that is used to be easier with on-premise servers, but now in the cloud environments, your data you can have copies and copies of data, which can cause some challenges further later on. So.
Good. Okay. So sounds like a busy time, and you're the only person, right, from the security team. So
that is correct. And so the basics, the hygiene factors, you've got to do the same. You've got to encrypt your endpoints, your laptops. You've got to make sure that your antivirus is, definitions are being updated. You've got to make sure that you have your inventory of laptops well documented, as well as all of the approved and sanctioned applications. And so that gets into identity management and single sign-on and zero trust, and so there's just a lot of the basics. We'll take care of 90% of the attack surface. That being said, you still have to threat model, you still have to have your run books ready to go so that you're planning and ready for when bad things happen.
Yeah, for sure. And Chad, the listeners will have picked up your accent. So where in the world are you coming from?
I have a Los Angeles accent. I grew up in North Hollywood, and so and live. Actually, you can see the Hollywood sign today. It's a nice sunny day here, but I've lived in multiple parts of the United States. Lived in Tucson, lived in Austin, Texas, as well as Boston, and I prefer the West Coast. It's for many reasons, and so we're very lucky here.
Very good. I think it's the SureCloud podcast has now gone international, and
Yes.
yeah, for sure. I look forward to when we go viral and we get the Hollywood Awards ceremonies and stuff like that. It'll be good. It'll be very good.
Yes.
Well, thank you for that, Chad. I appreciate the insight. James, same question too. So, what are you working on at the minute here at SureCloud? So, what's your kind of day-to-day look like? And similarly, whereabouts in the world are you coming from? You also have a fairly distinguished accent.
I do. I take that as a compliment, Nick. So currently, I think, as you know, because you're working with me on a lot of these things, there's a few things. So as a cyber consultancy, there's a few things now that I think are core to what all cyber consultancies should do. One is we should help clients fix stuff. I don't think clients need any more reports from us, any more PDFs about what's wrong, and some kind of prioritized recommendations. I think people now need both technical fixes, operational fixes, behavioral fixes. How can they reduce their risk? So that's what we're working on at the moment. Ransomware, obviously, is part and parcel of that, how we can help our clients become more resilient to ransomware. You and I, Nick, have been talking a lot about data and using data more extensively to make risk decision-making kind of evidence-based rather than sort of intuition, best practice-based. And I've got a personal thing that I like to work on with clients, which is all about security improvement. And how can we help them get from where they are currently to a position where they're more cyber resilient? And how can we build assets that help them fix their, back to Chad's point, kind of foundational hygiene things that are difficult to fix. Patching is a hygiene problem, but it's a really difficult hygiene problem, especially as you start getting bigger and you start having more complex systems. Kind of patching, although everyone says it's easy and we should do it, it's actually quite difficult to do when you're running multiple different environments, production, UAT, prod, testing. It just becomes a very, very difficult problem. So for me, that's what I keep thinking about. How can we best help our clients fix the problems that we know they've got?
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
With regard to geographies, I am in the southwest of the UK, but my accent is firmly in the East London, Essex boundaries. So depending on who I'm talking to, I can either be a chirpy East Londoner or I can be an Essex geezer.
A social chameleon, you might say.
Yeah, it's something along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, very good.
I'm learning something new today.
Nice. It's basically the same accent, I think, just slightly tweaked.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. It allows me to appeal to two different populations. It's fine.
Yeah. Very good. Right. So I guess today's episode, we are going to talk about the new act that is making its way through the US government. So at the minute, there's a bill there called the Strengthening American Cybersecurity Act of 2022. It is currently going through the Senate and the House for ratification and bringing it into legislation. So the bill itself is mostly aimed at kind of government agencies, US-based government agencies, and also operators of critical infrastructure. So there's a few things in there. And when we was trying to search for the kind of theme, so this is coming out, the news agencies have picked it up and started to talk about it a little bit. But I think there's kind of a wider theme here, which is around compliance and how compliance to requirements can help drive good practice, can help change how a market would react to how a market might pick up new services, new solutions, and that kind of thing. So there's definitely, from my view, I think there's definitely a driver for when compliance can be a good thing. And I guess what we're going to talk about on this podcast is that statement. So is compliance driving good practice? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Should we expect customers to do that off their own back? Organizations to do that off their own back? Or should we wait for governments to legislate and say, this is exactly what you should be doing? And that's the kind of theme that we're going to do today. The bill itself has quite a few interesting things in there. So there's the usual stuff. There's a couple of mentions around penetration testing, as you'd expect to find in a lot of these things. But there's a couple of points that we'll talk about as we go through this podcast that I've not necessarily seen before in legislation. So things like threat hunting programs, that's mentioned in there. Pen testing, so it talks about pen testing. All right, it's fairly commoditized. We know what that looks like, but we'll investigate how that's kind of changed over the years. So what does it look like now versus what it looked like 10 years ago, 5 years ago? There's a piece in here about ransomware, but particularly reporting of ransomware attacks within a timely, a time frame, and also whether you paid the ransom or not. So again, we'll touch upon ransomware. We'll get the thoughts of Chad and James as to whether that's a good, whether we think we should pay them, or whether we think we should not pay them, the pros and cons of each. Zero trust architecture is also mentioned in here about kind of establishing what a zero trust architecture looks like. I think this is quite timely given what's kind of floating around in the news at the minute with things like Okta. There are, it's not a conclusive story right now, so we can't comment on whether that did happen or didn't happen. But it does kind of throw up a wider question around reliance on identity providers within a zero trust architecture. What are the kind of risks for that? Where are we shifting the boundaries moving forwards? And then as we go along, there's probably other areas that where things can drive market changes. So things like cyber insurance actually can help to drive positive changes within the market, within organizations. And that's roughly what we're going to try and cover today as we go through this. So I guess first question I would have is to James and Chad. So what exactly do we mean by compliance driving good practices? What do you take from that statement? And do you think it is generally a good thing or a bad thing?
Do you want to go first, Chad, or shall I?
I'll start since I'm the yank on the call, and it's more relevant. I live it, and it's interesting because there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot, especially with this legislation. We have this. It's good that it's bipartisan. It's good that it's a federal. It's helping with some of our federal agencies, and especially with regard to the electrical grid and infrastructure. There's some good things in the legislation. First of all, it focuses on NIST. So if you want to do business with the government, something called GSA, which is the General Services Administration, part of that means getting involved with FedRAMP. FedRAMP is a Federal Risk and Authorization Management Act that was set up in 2011. Essentially what that is as the government gets into the cloud, as everyone else has, they have a standard way of doing it, and that's focused is on NIST. So that's a good thing, I think. Focusing on standards we already have and not reinventing the wheel is good. And it brings some, for businesses who want to do business with the government as their main vendor, it's a good thing to let them understand what the cost of doing business is, and that they will need to have a security program in place so that they can do what needs to be done and check the box. The other thing that this bill does, it has some funding in it. There's a Jobs Act component. So there is some funding for states to be able to actually execute on these new requirements. So I think that's a good thing as well as the information sharing around ransomware and who paid it, who didn't pay it, things like that. And as we, there's having a higher level is not a bad thing. I think I think there's a lot of standards, a lot of I guess there's a difference between security and compliance. And so compliance is great. And then there's where the rubber meets the road, and where, that's what I call security. So I want to do more than what's the minimally acceptable. If I can, obviously there's a limited amount of resources, but I'm also managing risk as well. So there's a lot of, my CFO is the owner of the risk. So I have to escalate these issues with him so that he understands and can guide me on how to follow up. Sometimes it costs too much to mitigate a risk. Sometimes we ignore it or we get to it later. It's a Q3, Q4 issue. And sometimes you get breached because you haven't gotten to things yet. So there's just a lot of conversation around risk management. That's important that this brings up, and having more things to work from a checklist, if you will, is not a bad thing, in the greater scheme of things, especially when it comes to working with the government. So,
yeah, I like the distinction that you made there about between compliance and security.
Yeah.
So wanting to do the right things already. So I guess when you got a company and you've got someone who's motivated to make that happen, there's these new bills, for example, and the new legislations. Are they kind of a reaffirmation of what you common sense, right? So you're doing these already, I would imagine, in quite a few cases.
Yeah, I think that we're still going to have the focus on different state laws. We have laws in Virginia. We have laws that just passed in Colorado. We have California law. There's more on the docket. If you go to the IAPP website, there's a whole secret decoder ring that has each state, each bill, and what it covers, as well as a map that shows the coverage from all 50 states and where they are. That being said, I think those are things that you have to be two-headed about it. You have to take those things into account. Look at CCPA, the California law, confirm that it applies to you based. The rules for California are a lot different than others. You have to have a certain size. You have to do a certain amount of business. It's interesting. So a lot of times when I'm asked, "Are we California compliant?" Well, you have to. Yeah, it depends. Not everyone has to be California compliant, and it doesn't mean that you're doing business in California or not. It has to do with the ability to take a California resident out of your system through a data subject access request. So you have to have the ability technically to do that at minimum. But it goes on and on. That being said, the devil's in the details, and we need to, as security practitioners, know what the rules are and and how to comply with them at the end of the day, because that's what's going to improve our security posture.
Yeah, for sure. And I might just pick up on a point that you made earlier on as well around some risks are not worth spending money on to fix, right? So that's all about getting your level of spend on security and defensive controls to the right level based on your threat model. I think is what you're kind of suggesting is sometimes the thing that you need to do. You don't need to defend against all the things. You need to defend against your relevant threat model, right?
Yeah, and that goes zero trust, and so where are my crown jewels? Not only physically within the cloud, but also who has credentials to those assets, both intellectual property on the software development side, as well as PCI and PII, personally identifiable information in payment card industry, so credit card numbers, which I hope we're not storing on site. And so there's all of that to keep organized, if you will, because if you don't know about it, then there's going to be blind spots and there's going to be some issues with being able to manage it and move it and measure it. You can't manage it if you can't measure it. You can't manage it. If you can't manage it, you can't move it. So I like to know everything in my environment so that I can take action if needed.
Very good. Yeah, no, sounds good. So James, I might bring you in there if that's okay. Couple of thoughts, if you would, on the kind of the thing about the right level of spend for defensive controls, that kind of thing, if you would.
I think what's interesting, so I've been doing governance compliance frameworks for a lot of years now, and what they helped with, they helped to have a set of de facto controls that we could implement to reduce risk, and that sounds like a great idea, and people being encouraged to do that. And then we got into a good 15-year period of kind of running the spreadsheet approach to security, and we tick the controls and we've done the controls, so therefore we are secure. And I saw that, especially doing a lot of PCI work over the years as a QSA. And I think it's something that Chad said about doing the right thing. It's moving from sort of, I think there's 3 phases in this. There's moving from the everything's on fire approach to security, and you're just running about putting stuff out. Then you move into the compliance approach to security, i.e., I've now got a tick list of things I need to do. So rather than being ad hoc, as I remember to do them on a Friday, we now move into this is weekly, this is daily, this is monthly, and I'll do the controls. And I think where we really need to move to, it's kind of going forwards, but really it's going backwards, is to becoming threat and risk centric and taking a more holistic view of the organisation and what we're trying to protect. So I think it's a difficult job for governments to try and enforce security. Back to my threes, you'll see I love things in threes. So typically people fall into three groups. There's going to be the group that doesn't care and doesn't do it. There's going to be the group that does it because they have to. And then there's going to be the group that kind of embraces not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law and does the right thing, as Chad mentioned. And there's no way of knowing the size of each group, but I definitely think the driver for it is the kind of the appetite within the business, the culture within the business itself, within the organisation, to say, we're going to do this for the right reason. So I was talking to a client last week about ISO 27001, and they want to do it to embed a risk-driven approach to security within the business, which we said was, yeah, fantastic, the right approach. How you then balance doing all of that and not spending too much, not spending £10 to protect a £1 asset, I think is a real, it's kind of, it's very threat asset risk focused. How do we make sure that we're protecting the right assets? How do we make sure that we've carved those crown jewels off, that they're very difficult to get to? All of those things come into play. But back to the legislation, I think, you're only really going to capture the top two groups. You're going to get the tick box group, and you're going to get the group that really wants to do it properly. Even if you're really doing it properly already, nobody was ever compliant by accident. So I said this through my PCI career. You can't just accidentally become PCI compliant because you're trying to do the right things. You really have to focus on the outcome. So if it was GDPR for us in the EU and now in the UK, or if it's PCI or ISO, you've really got to focus on each one and getting to each one compliant. So it's a challenge when you've got another set of regulations coming out, or Chad's got regulations coming out from different states, plus at a federal level. It becomes very, very difficult, I think, for organisations to attempt to manage all of these at any one time and remain compliant against all of them at the same time. I think basically it's an impossibility. You will have periods of non-compliance that you're not quite aware of whilst you're running compliant, just because of the level of complexity these days.
Yeah, I guess doing the right things though does help you become compliant. So I guess if you're doing the right things, then you will take some of the things off that need to be done.
Yeah, I think you could do the right things and be more secure, be less risky, but still not be compliant.
Yeah, no, totally.
Because PCI is a perfect example of 6.3.2.1.8. Kind of really, that's difficult to be compliant with unless you're really thinking about that specific requirement and how you evidence that to the assessor. So I think doing the right thing will probably reduce risk and make you more secure, but it may not automatically make you compliant.
Yeah, for sure. So are there any real world examples where kind of new compliance has helped to drive good standards? So you mentioned GDPR, James, probably one of the more recent good examples, I guess. But are there any others that we can share?
I'd like to think yes. I'd like to think it's kind of a rising tide rises all boats. So going back to statistics a bit. So I know they can prove anything you want them to prove, but PCI, there's still a huge volume of merchants that are taking cards that are not PCI compliant. And, we've had a good 16-year run at this. It's not a surprise, it's part of your contract. So I don't think it's natural to assume that because you're in scope for something, it's going to automatically make everybody fall into line behind it. I think, and if you look at credit card fraud, credit card fraud has gone exponential, even though we've supposedly got more and more secure and better at protecting card data. So that for me would suggest that maybe it hasn't worked. But equally, the flip side would be, what would it be like if we didn't have PCI in place? Would it be even worse? If we didn't have point-to-point encryption and et cetera, would it be worse than it is already? So I think it's difficult to say that things have got better, especially as we see more ransomware breaches. Does that mean security has got worse, or does that mean the attackers have got better, or a combination of the two? Will legislation help us combat this? I'd like to think it would, but down on the ground, I'm not quite sure. I'm still a bit stuck on that one. Not quite sure that it would do.
No, fair enough. Yeah, that's a good point. And Chad, is there any that you could think of that have kind of led to good things?
I mean, I think so. Day one at Clyde, I was introduced to two things. One, we were in the middle of a pen test, so that was good, and I was able to get up to speed and help me understand the tech stack a lot more quickly. And then the second part was, here's our SOC 2 Type 1 that's going to be done at the end of the month, which was good because I was able to come in and close that out. I think there's having these gap analysis in advance of trying to get the report either in either a SOC 2 Type 1 or a Type 2 or an ISO. I think those are important. You need to understand where the gaps are internally within your organization, where you need better controls and processes. You're only as good as, your standards, your policies, and your procedures on paper can look great, and they may not be real. And so you've got to have a mix. You've got to have the policies and standards and procedures, and you also have to have tested them out and make sure that they work. So I think that there's that dichotomy of theory and practice that we live every day as practitioners, and it's and the tooling is actually better, I would say. So being able to comply with some of these new standards and that are coming from different states here in the U.S. and the federal government, I think the vendors have gotten very good about generating that PCI SAQ from the admin control panel of the merchant service provider you're using. So yeah, I think that while it might be more arduous in some ways, there are better tools out there to help with or at least helping to check the box. Not fully, but maybe 90%. And then that's a conversation with you and the person that wants the evidence and is either your auditor or the merchant's compliance team, privacy team. Yeah. Everyone's trying to reduce risk at the end of the day. And so we have to just remember that.
And I think picking up on Chad's point, Nick, you and I have been discussing for quite some time, combining the theory and the practical, and I think that's the real trick to compliance and making it work is taking those theoretical constructs of kind of control domains and then stress testing them against what you've actually got in place, and can the controls be bypassed in an attack, in a pen test, in a red team, and if they can be bypassed by an attacker without your detection capability picking it up, then the tick boxing that you've done for compliance is falling a little short. So you need to then go beyond the compliance to make sure that you can best protect the organization that you're in.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that. That's good. So we can come on to that point as we go along, I think. So a little question, little curveball question that I didn't put in the pre notes or anything, but compliance is, let's be honest, it's inherently boring. Can it be fun? Can it be fun? That's the question I would ask.
I would say yes. I've got tooling I had a compliance tool in my past company that enabled us as a 2,500 person organization to assign tasks, to the right stakeholders. And so with in the past role, having 3 SOC 2s and combining the control language, standardizing, I should say, the control language as well as the time frame of the audit was good. But it can be fun. I think a lot of it is chasing, herding cats. And at the same time, some of the new tools that I have do a lot of the automation. So it'll go into the different cloud providers and pull up an alert to say, hey, your S3 bucket isn't encrypted, for example. And so there's a lot of automation that these tools do that take a lot of the boringness out of and a lot of it's not just a document, a place to gather documents for evidence. It can actually help with allowing a person like myself to do more threat hunting and offensive security and red teaming, while the tool itself does the compliance work, or much of the compliance work. I still have to, remind myself to upload that report out of the different systems. But at the same time, that's any challenge with, with the security metrics and proving to the executive team that we have a more mature security posture in different areas, and how do we show that progression over time. So yeah, I think it can be fun. You can make it fun. You can gamify it. We do that with internal pen testing. I'm sorry, not pen testing. Sorry, with phishing exercises, and those are always those are interesting because my user base was first upset about it and then have come around and have fun with it, and there's a competition to see who can find that phishing attack that's internal, and very obvious sometimes and sometimes not so, depending on my mood. But in all seriousness, I think there's ways to make it fun. And at the end of the day, it's about education. Every opportunity to change behavior is good. And that's I think part of my role is to educate my user base around why they shouldn't click on things, how to identify certain attacks, how to manage not only their work hygiene, but their personal hygiene. So around breaches. So if my social media is breached, what would I do? And that's kind of how I pose it to them. And it hits home because there's a lot of things on social media that people want to keep to themselves. And so losing your phone or losing your password is as important nowadays as anything else. And we can bring those personal lessons to work.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I appreciate the answers there. So what I suggest we do now is we can dive into some of the key points that are in the bill. So there's a few things in that bill there that I think are good to talk about, and some will take a little bit longer than others. That's fine. So we've picked out a few here. So number one is threat hunting programs. We'll talk a little bit about that. Penetration testing is on there as number 2. So that's something that's been in these things for a long time, but I'd be interested to kind of get your thoughts on how that's changed over the years. Ransomware is on there. Obviously, it's kind of one of the key current threats of 2022 and 2021 and probably 2023, if let's be honest. So it'd be good to kind of have a bit of insight around that, get your kind of thoughts on it. And then, as mentioned at the start of the program, we'll do zero trust architecture. So what does that look like in practice? And we'll try and ask Chad if you get able to share anything from a Clyde perspective as we go along. So yeah. First things first, and let's get into the threat hunting stuff. So this is in here about doing an ongoing threat hunting program is what it's talked about. It's aimed at government agencies in the US, right?
Yep.
There is little detail around what is meant by a threat hunting program. So first question to James and Chad is, what do we mean by a threat hunting program? So what is that? What does it look like? How do you implement it? What kind of things are you looking for in that regard?
Sure. I guess I'll start. I think the definition, I looked up the definition just because I was curious. It was about proactively and iteratively searching systems for threats that evade detection. So basically manual threat hunting. So those are the logic, how your application behaves. And that's a lot of things that are found with software development lifecycle work. So security headers, all of the OWASP top 10, those are keys, as well as being able to look at the newsletters that I'm subscribed to multiple newsletters, and so what's out there. And at the end of the day, you want to make it as hard for the bad guy to get into your systems as possible, so that they go somewhere else. And so yeah, I think threat hunting is key. You've got to do a little bit of red teaming as a security practitioner. You've got to open up Burp Suite, and you've got to spend money on a dynamic scanner. You've also got to invest, if you have the money, to do linting and all the other software development. There's some great vendors that have code scanning tools. And then you've also got to keep your bill of materials up to snuff for two reasons. One, for intellectual property reasons, you got to have the right licenses if you're using open source software. And then the second part, which is kind of as important, is can you patch what's some of these libraries. Kubernetes, which we have, has some challenges because there are some CVEs that you can't patch. So you have to be able to be methodical about it, going back to what James was mentioning about patching and hygiene. What do I patch? When do I patch it? If I patch something, does it break my application, unfortunately? And so there's a lot of, and you're into backporting as well. So you've got to, I'm at the right OS, but I'm patched as much as I can. So there's a lot of conversation around the security posture of at least our applications internally. And I do a lot of educating of our software developers. What is a security header? Why is it important? What is TLS, and why is it important? Things like that. Why is it important for us to lock everything down, known ports and unknown ports? Is traffic, what is good traffic and what is bad traffic? We have to have our own definition of that. And then also the cadence of when does that traffic hit, so that if there is some traffic that we're not expecting, we can address it, and making sure that I can fine tune the alerts that we have, so that if there is something I need to go and hunt down on my logs, I'm in there looking at it. So it's a lot of different things, but it's important at the end of the day. And however it comes to be, whether you're legislated to do it or you do it because it's the right thing to do. I mean, those are the challenges, really.
Yeah, nice. I like the thing that you just mentioned there about threat hunting. So threat hunting in general, so looking in all these kind of areas, building things out securely from scratch, I think is a good starting point. And then also you mentioned around kind of baselining, so knowing what normal looks like on a given system, on a given network, a given asset, is absolutely key and critical to doing this kind of threat hunting program. Yes, if you know exactly what good looks like on a Friday afternoon, for example, sure, and something anomalous comes out of that and looks really, a spike in traffic, or suddenly communicating outbound to something that you don't recognize, then okay, that's probably going to get your spidey senses tingling a little bit and think, something don't look quite right here.
Yes.
I need to investigate that a little bit further. I'm going to bring James in here. So James, is the whilst said there wasn't a definition, there's 4 words that kind of define what this means, which I'll read it to you. It says, establish a program of ongoing hypothesis-driven threat hunting services. So, help me out here. Is hypothesis-driven threat hunting services, is that simply doing threat modeling, threat intel, and then developing attack paths off the back of that and checking them? Is that roughly it?
I think that you've got to build these hypotheses out, haven't you? And then obviously you've got to test them. I was thinking, while Chad was talking, I'm looking at the problem slightly differently. So the types of organisations we work with, I know they're not always going to be kind of CNI, to use a UK term, but threat hunting is a step on for many organisations. That they might be doing some threat modelling, that they might be looking at having threat intel feeds, etc. But threat hunting is then the next step on in how do we become active rather than just passive. How do we go looking for this stuff rather than just accepting that it might be on the network, but we're not sure on the we're not sure the efficacy of our detection tools, and how good they are, so we're going to go hunting for them. I think there will be a challenge for the cyber community to have enough good threat hunters available to be executing this work. The Chad's description would suggest that these are complex attack paths with attackers who can evade detection using, let's assume that people are running some good EDR tooling and you're evading good EDR tooling. So these attackers are using some really good techniques to remain off the radar. So to find them, you're going to need some really good people to be working all the tools to go and find potentially indicators of compromise that haven't been picked up by any of the tooling that you're running. So I think that's going to be a big challenge for organisations. But like all compliance, it's got to remain vague so that it doesn't dictate how you execute this. But then equally, it's going to prompt a lot of questions from the community saying, what does that mean? Is this compliant? How do we do this? But I think from a cybersecurity consultancy, there are cybersecurity consultancies that look at themselves here and say, this is a new market, or this is something that we need to develop to service the client market, because it will get bigger. There'll be a bigger requirement for third-party threat hunting than probably there is currently, I would imagine. That's sort of the way I see it panning out.
Okay, excellent, thank you. So yeah, some good points there, I think, around the threat hunting stuff. I pulled it out because it's one of the first times I'd seen it written down as a you must do this action type thing. So yeah, I think it's good to start seeing that type of thing in there, and it will pay dividends, I think, in the long term. One of the other points that I wanted to kind of cover off is, and we can do this briefly because everyone kind of knows what pen testing is, and it's been around for a long time. It's fairly commoditized, etc., etc. However, what I want to kind of cover off here with you guys is how has compliance changed that over the years. So obviously a pen test now doesn't look quite the same as it did 10 years ago. Actually, what actually happens is what's old is new again. So things tend to go around in a bit of a circle here. So compliance might become fashionable and trendy again soon enough, and that'll be kind of the drive in the market. But yeah, curious to see what you think.
It will never be fashionable and trendy. I think you're right on what is old is new, or vice versa. So when pen testing was invented back in the day, it looked more like red teaming, and its intent was more like red teaming and purple teaming, and then it became a compliance activity. So PCI is my bugbear here. It's driven everybody to an annual pen test, as if nothing in the intervening 350 days happens on your network or happens out in the threat actor community. We've found some exploitable vulnerabilities, we've fixed them, and now we're good to go for another 350 days till we kick off the next pen test. We've got a declare at SureCloud. We do loads of annual pen testing for people, and we're trying to get them to move to a more continuous approach for testing. And also, pen testing has become very kind of scope driven. So can you test this system, please? As opposed to saying, can you move between the systems? I think there's lots of underlap in networks where controls kind of miss between two systems. So it's easy for testers to move between systems, to laterally move across networks, than it is kind of within a system sometimes. So just keep focusing pen testing on a chunk of the network or a particular single system. I think it's not the greatest way to gain technical assurance. And I hope we move more towards a red teaming view of the world, like the C-best, T-best cyber approaches. And I'm hoping that the cost base will come down, to enable clients to use this approach kind of more cost effectively and more regularly.
Yeah, no, fantastic insights. Yeah, I really would agree with all of what you said there, I think. Chad, just from your point of view, is there anything that you might add in there to what James has just mentioned?
Yeah, obviously, you've got the SOC 2, you've got a control that you're going to have an annual pen test. You do the annual pen test because it's part of the control. And obviously, what you said is quite true. It's a snapshot in time. It's not, it's good to have. You have to have it to have a baseline, and then from there you work on getting those stories pointed and getting the level of effort for fixing security headers, for fixing SQL injection attacks, for fixing unencrypted buckets, things like that. I mean, those are all, you take the pen test and you roll them into your system, and you throw those back at the software team, and you get them fixed, or your infrastructure team. So there's got to be that cycle of and what we do as well is we have a weekly dynamic scan. So we're scanning production endpoints on a weekly basis and taking anything that comes up, because obviously we have product builds and things change in our environment, and so I need to keep ahead of that. So the biggest thing is to have the tooling in place so that when the pen tester comes in, you kind of already know what they're going to find, and you can either fix it or let them find it and then fix it afterwards. And you're playing offense instead of defense, and it becomes a conversation around scope and sequence and fixing, rather than I don't know what I don't know, which is the worst thing. So I think you can use it in the right way. You can also use it to kind of work with your QA team. And OWASP has something called ASVS, which is essentially a regression smoke testing to be able to test against, instead of the happy path, you're testing as if you're a bad actor. So let's test our passwords. I'm going to try to test our password policy. I'm going to try to test, any number of things. And so being able to work as a security practitioner with our QA team and writing those Selenium tests, so that when we're doing another round of product release, we're not only testing we're not only testing the happy path, if you will, that the software actually works, but we're introducing a malicious script and seeing if that goes through. We're introducing any number of things. And so that helps with the security posture, and I can evidence that with any number of stakeholders, a merchant or an auditor. So that's going to help me educate my software development team as well as my QA team on what is the vulnerability, why it's important to fix. And because my challenge as a security practitioner is the YouTube videos that show someone how to get into a system, the vendors that sell tools that mock a Wi-Fi network, or something you can plug into your USB port that automatically injects malicious software that that can be used against me. So the level of the cost of entry for a bad actor, as well as ransomware as a service, hacking as a service, all of those things, and the associated Bitcoin that goes to pay them off. I mean, those I'm fighting against those every day. So I want to do what I can to make it hard for those bad actors to get into my network, and as well as insider threats to be able to cut those off. So those are the things that keep me up at night. Act like a good guy, test like a bad guy, but use your powers for good and not evil.
Yeah, for sure. I like that, and I'm glad you said I'm glad you mentioned the ASVS, because I love it personally. I think it's a fantastic resource. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah, and I think also there was a school of thought, and thankfully it's dying off a little bit, but it used to be quite prevalent in the past, which was, hey, you're the pen testers. Why am I going to give you any credentials. You should work them out yourself. Or why do you need me to give you the IP addresses? You work them out yourself. But I think there seems to be a shift now. So I guess from your point of view there, Chad, you said you're running a lot of things. Would you go as far as to share the results of that kind of stuff that you're doing internally with the pen testers that you have in-house to, the third party, try and boost their kind of value, I guess, ultimately as well?
Well, absolutely. I think they're going to find it anyway. I think a good pen test is a very small report. I've seen pen tests that are 100 pages. And so with large appendices, and those are no fun because you have to fix them within a certain time frame, or else that shows up on the report again. And then it becomes a conversation about not why did it take you so long to fix what was identified a year ago. That gets to be, that gets into hygiene. But yeah, I want to be transparent for two reasons. One, I'm building a relationship with that pen tester and that pen test company. And I also want to sometimes I want it to show up on the report to explain to management, hey, we still haven't fixed this. This has shown up on the last 2 pen test reports, and it's a high or a medium. This is a risk. Whether you understand it or not, you own it, Mr. CFO or Mrs. CFO. How do you want me to handle your risk? That's kind of the and it's important. I think it's important to escalate some things, but you have to be very thoughtful about that and strategic, because you can't cry wolf. But you're not going to get any traction that way. You have to pick and choose your battles for sure. But at the same time, that goes back to your relationship with your software development team and getting those stories that are highlighting vulnerabilities pointed and scheduled into a future sprint.
Yeah, good. No, I like that. It's very good. So guys, let's move on to the next point, which is about ransomware. So like I say, a hot topic, has been for a long time now. Seems to be quite if you're talking about the things that keep you up at night, this is probably high on the list for the majority of CISOs, security engineers, anyone related to security and defending an organization. So I guess current questions I have around, what's the current threat landscape look like from a ransomware perspective, particularly for an organization like Clyde, Chad. So what things are you expecting to see in this area? Are you kind of concerned by it? Is it something that's driving you?
Oh, for sure. I think so. Ransomware has driven cyber insurance premiums up. Underwriters are requiring at minimum 2-factor before they'll even consider giving you cyber insurance, as well as to be able to share a ransomware runbook and policy. So the good news is that it makes you have to think about what your plan is on the operation side. How often are we backing up documents? Are users able to back up? How often are they backing up their documents to SharePoint, Google Drive, etc.? Because as a security practitioner, and I've seen some pretty nasty ransomware that evades we had Windows Defender at my previous company, and then this ransomware evaded. It would pop up and then go to sleep, and then pop up and talk, and send messages out. At the end of the day, I'm just going to wipe your machine and give you a new image, and whatever data you've lost, that's a lesson learned. We've told you to back up your stuff. Make sure you do it. So I need to understand what operationally, how often I'm backing things up, where those backups occur, because I need to be able to pull the trigger and continue operations if there is something in my environment. And the ransomware is pretty nasty. And the amount of time it takes to do the forensics on it and find the keys, and there are websites out there where you can find the keys for some of these. Do you have time to do that? If you have an entire department, that's not a bad way to go. That being said, it depends on the value of that document or two, or however much work you're going to lose. That's your best defense against ransomware is your backup policy, and as well as your virus protection and all the other things. So I think, and then you have to think about how does that get into the network through USB drives. You have USB policy to disable the ability to put a USB drive into your computer, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to think about all of the different, parts of how a bad actor can get in with ransomware, both through phishing, through physical, through thumb drives and the like, and malicious websites, and think about that entire attack surface. And you're not going to get everything, but if you can get to 90% with a good backup policy, then you're in good shape.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Cheers, Chad. James, should an organization ever pay a ransom?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that question. This is where the theory and practice really do, I think, bump into each other. So, kind of everyone from governments down and agencies, everyone would tell you not to pay the ransom because of the knock-on effect of where that money goes, what else it does. Obviously, it promotes more ransomware work because ransomware is now very, very profitable. So let's keep doing it. But equally, if you're the organization that cannot get access to the backups because they're encrypted as well, and you're now fully non-production, you can't pay suppliers, you can't pay staff, you can't raise invoices, you can't service customers, you can't run your operations. If the only economic out is to pay a ransom, I defy many people not to look at that seriously and think about paying it. It'd be great to think we could legislate for not paying it, but I think that there'll be a whole bunch of downstream law of unintended consequences. Where do the attackers go? If everybody's told not to pay it, what do we do with those businesses that go out of business? How do we support them? What happens if a public, in the UK, what happens if an NHS trust is ransomware and is out of operation? I think it's probably the most challenging threat that we've faced from a cyber perspective. For many organisations, it becomes kind of existential. After a couple of weeks of not working, this is now an existential problem. If we come back in a week, 2 weeks, a month, will we still be able to run our operation? Will our customers have moved elsewhere? Will we have burned all of our cash that we've already been burning during the pandemic? So we've now got less cash reserves than we used to have. I think it's a really, really thorny problem. And I know I haven't answered the question, and I've done that. I've got to be honest, I've probably done that on purpose. I've sat on the fence to say, it's one for the whole industry. This is not just cyber experts, but this is governments to think about this problem and how do we design policy to help organisations survive a ransomware attack, but equally not encourage ransomware actors to kind of grow their operations. I think yes, it's highly challenging. So I think back to you, Nick, for an answer.
Well, to be honest, it was a loaded question, so I appreciate that it's not a straight yes or no. I think there is an idealistic point of view, which is we shouldn't pay it. However, I would fully agree with you. I don't think there's a cut and dry case in a lot of situations. So it'll be on a case by case basis, and often it might be the last resort. And actually, the ransom itself may actually be less, money than what you're losing on a hourly, daily basis type thing. So
it might well be, and I think for each individual organisation, for me, ransomware can be mitigated through layered cyber defences, and it's only with all of the defences failing that you end up in a position where kind of your entire business is offline. So I think it's back to threat modeling, back to what you and Chad have mentioned as well, about what controls do we need to deploy, and then let's look at what happens if that control fails. What happens if the actor evades the EDR? Okay, right. What happens if the ransomware drop then pervades the network? Right. And we have to run through all of the scenarios so that we can ultimately keep our backups in a separate part of the network somewhere. And we've probably run some. Nick, you and I, we're doing this with customers at the moment. We're running kind of red teams against backup systems to see if we can get access to them, see if we can compromise them, take them offline, because all of a sudden backups have gone from being something that hasn't been talked about in cybersecurity for the last 10 or 15 years to something that's now fundamental to the kind of continued operation of the business. So it's
what's old is new again.
Yeah,
exactly. Even my fashions, they're coming round again.
Exactly.
And if I may, I think the as a startup, the conversation that I have is, okay, and this is how I do the math. I'm looking at my systems and the dollars per record. I use Ponemon as a way to guesstimate. This is how many records I have. This is what Ponemon says is how much that customer record is worth, and then I'm doing the math on that. So that's the value of my system, and then I'm looking at how much it costs to engage a third party to do forensics, and then that price goes up based on my SLA. So I could spend a lot of money on bringing in the cavalry, bringing in the reinforcements like within an hour, or I can spend less money to have them come in 24 to 48 hours. And so that goes back to my, there's risk. I've identified it. I have to escalate that and then let the risk owner decide how much money they want to spend on a forensics opportunity. So with a third party company, because and some companies have forensics staff members, which is great. Others don't. That being said, I think that's the conversation that I'm in as a startup that has minimal resources, but has to be very focused in how I use them. So
very good. Yeah, I think one thing we could probably all agree on is that the need to report these kind of things centrally to some sort of threat sharing feed, that kind of stuff, and whether you paid ransom or not, that's probably a good thing, right? So I think that's probably recognised as the right thing to do.
Yeah, but I think back to balancing the legislation. It's kind of if the legislation's punitive on those people that have paid ransoms, but then wants them to report those, then it's a balancing act, isn't it? You can't punish people for paying a ransom because it's their only option out of this particular problem, and then on the flip side, then also you shouldn't have done that, so we're going to punish you. So it's kind of, I think there's a real balance to be struck for businesses. They don't want to be ransomwared, and they're not aiming to be ransomwared. They're a victim of crime. So it's how do we support them, and how do we encourage them to do the best they can, doing the right thing. Back to Chad right up at the top, doing the right thing to best protect themselves. That's ultimately what I think what it's about.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, cool. So guys, the last point I want to talk about here is pulled out of the bill is around zero trust architecture. Yes. So that's kind of mentioned in there about should implement it, should be using it, that kind of thing. But again, I wanted to get a real world insight from you, Chad, first and foremost, if you could. Sure. Just kind of what does that look like at in an organization like Clyde, so a tech startup. I'm assuming cloud native. So what does zero trust architecture look like and mean for you ultimately?
Yeah, I think those user access reviews become pretty important. That inventory of sanctioned applications becomes important. Having a cloud access security broker is important because as I need to know that when that person is terminated, that they still can't get into the system that they've signed up for that we may or may not know about. And so, the idea of identity and least privilege comes into play very, very strongly. And so we want to make sure that we're doing single sign-on and multi-factor for a number of reasons. But we also want to look at the kind of the operations. Where are the ETL, the extract, transform, and load processes? How is data moving from our front end to our back end? When we do our analytics, who has access to those reports? Are we handling data in a secure fashion? The good news is that we've been able to keep those data silos pretty locked down, and that's kind of key. Previous companies I've worked at, there are just data teams that are working on different problems that are putting data in different places, and so there's not a central source of truth, which causes challenges. From a security perspective, who has access to what data? Once again, going back to my simple question of where's my PII and where's my PCI? But also from when you think about lawsuits and e-discovery, it's going to cost more because you have copies of data, and then they're going to find something during discovery that you don't want. So you have to think about it from a legal perspective as well, which nobody wants to, but you have to, because it's going to happen. You're going to have lawsuits. There's going to be emails that are going to be subpoenaed and put on legal holds and things like that. So zero trust is pretty important. I think you just have to look at microsegmentation and really kind of go through the system like a good guy, go through a system like a bad guy. And from a personal perspective, I mean, you have to think about, if I have to change, in 2,500 passwords for all of my employees and my service accounts because there's a bad actor that got into my network, will something break? So if you have microsegmentation, it may break, but not as hard. Things like that. And that goes into the threat modeling, where if someone does get into my system, where do they get in? How do they get in? Where do they get in? And what will they get out if they do get into certain parts of the network? Will they get nothing? Will it be a futile exercise where they just say, okay, I give up because this was too hard? You don't want to make it easy for the bad actors. That's kind of the key. So I think looking at ports, open ports, looking at understanding your IP addresses in your environment, and looking at, once again, what is good traffic and what is bad traffic is pretty important. And flowing that all out and documenting it and looking at the data flows is key to be able to, one, have the evidence for an auditor, but two, be able to say with some sort of certainty that where the weak points in your architecture is, and then you can plan for some defense in depth. You can, change some credentials. You can do a lot of different things very quickly to reduce the attack surface.
Yeah, that's right. So the boundaries are also shifting, right? So you're moving from your perimeter and everything inside it is secure to kind of the perimeter is everywhere. So I might bring James quickly on that one, if you don't mind. What would you say about the kind of, I guess in this instance now, zero trust? Then the identity provider is absolutely critical to everything here.
Yeah, agreed. And I haven't got much beyond what Chad said, but I think you're right to focus on identity. Back to old being the new. Kind of identity was always the number one control. Maybe you put physical security before it potentially, but kind of if you don't know who's on the systems, how on earth do you protect your systems? But now with the kind of boundaryless organization that's cloud native, identity becomes absolutely crucial. And obviously us as a security consultancy, Nick, that there's probably numerous occasions where we could quote the kind of misconfiguration of identity applications that enabled attackers to get onto systems, or enabled authentication to be bypassed. So it now becomes crucial. It's the new firewall, and therefore probably a lot of our thinking about how we best protect our business needs to be put into identity and authentication.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, guys, I think that brings us to an end. appreciate the insights, Chad. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you along with us for this particular episode. James, thank you very much for your insights. No doubt we'll have you on a future one. And that's it from us. So thank you, everybody. Wish you all well, and see you on the next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you.